There's a few signs that a game might either be a hidden gem or something best left hidden. No listing on how long to beat, no guide listed on game FAQs, and a box that proclaims it includes over 90 minutes of FMV. So which category does Klingon Academy fall into? Well, it's complicated. Welcome, my name's Azadash and welcome to another retrospective video. Now, space combat games had a lot of household names in the 90s. Wing Commander, X-Wing, TIE Fighter, X-Wing vs TIE Fighter, Descent. Every year without fail would generally see one released, and as a lover of all things sci-fi, I really enjoyed all of them and would still count at least one of these games in my top 10 video games of all time. However, in modern times, there hasn't just been a shortage, there's practically been a drought, at least of games where the primary gameplay is space combat. We did get Star Wars Squadrons, and I did enjoy that, but apart from that, I haven't played any space combat games I've enjoyed in a long time. That is, until I decided to reinstall Klingon Academy. First of all, I am aware that Klingon Academy, released in the year 2000, is a derivative of Starfleet Academy, released in 1997. However, at least on the surface, they are quite different. Which one is better? I can't say, because at the time of producing this video, I've never actually played Starfleet Academy. Alas, it is something I plan on playing soon. Klingon Academy, on the other hand, is a game I have extensive experience with, being first captivated by its demo and then later purchasing the 6 CD full game. As a child, I never finished the single-player campaign. I assumed I was just not skillful enough to complete it. However, as I'll go into more detail soon, that might not have been the actual reason. Alas, I did get great enjoyment in dreaming up all of these hypothetical scenarios and playing them out in the skirmish mode of the game. Now, the version we're playing today is the original PC version with the latest official patch. However, there is still a dedicated online community which has created a patch to enable this to run on more modern PCs, as well as fix some of the issues you might encounter. While I didn't personally deploy this as I wanted the original experience here, it's probably something I would suggest considering if you're going to check the game out, as it will not run on modern PCs. The reception for Klingon Academy is probably best described as average, with it holding a Metacritic rating of 74. Objectively, I think this is about right. However, I will say that Klingon Academy is one of the best examples of a game that with just a little more development time, I feel they could have really ironed out some of its challenges and easily earned a 10-point uplift in its Metacritic rating. The story here serves as somewhat of a prologue to Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, and it does a great job of filling in a lot more backstory to the overall plot of the movie, while detouring to tell a few of its own stories too. Probably the biggest takeaway for me was that you get a lot more insight about some of the movie characters' motivations, which are a lot easier to build over the course of a 25-odd-hour campaign than that of a 2-hour movie. You assume the role of Torlek, son of Rofa, who has just joined the Klingon Elite Command Academy, led by none other than the late Christopher Plummer's General Chang. As you progress through a variety of Academy missions, a new storyline, which introduces political tensions in the Klingon Empire, comes to bear, and Torlek is subsequently thrust into the center of an all-out civil war. It's one of those stories that you really need to pay attention to because there are a lot of moving parts, and I'll be honest, when I was a child, I had no idea the story was so deep, but as an adult, I can certainly appreciate it much more. The story is punctuated even more by an outstanding cast of characters with performances and voice acting that is top-notch. Christopher Plummer, David Warner, Michael Dorn. Wait a minute.
Do not confuse me with my famous brother, Colonel Worf, the Imperial Arbiter for the High Council.
Right, good. All of these and more really help tie the narrative thread between the game and the movie, and I certainly don't think that this could have been done as well without their contributions. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's engage our cloak, plot a course, and head back to the year 2000 to remember Star Trek Klingon Academy. In a space combat sim, there are two things you need to get right: the experience the player has interacting with their own ship and the experience the player has in interacting with the environment. Klingon Academy does one of these great and the other okay. Sometimes. First, the good. The game absolutely nails the control and command of the player's ship. While a lot of other combat space simulators have dealt with fighter-sized craft, Klingon Academy deals with capital ship-sized craft. Ships that are hundreds of times larger than a fighter, and true to the series, they control more like capital ships. The game has managed to perfect the feeling of controlling such a large ship, with things like inertia playing a very large part in control. On the topic of control, while you can use a keyboard and mouse, or use a workaround for a controller, I opted for what I consider the best control option for any space sim, a joystick. The joystick, in my case, controlled the ship's direction and firing its weapons, while the keyboard supported all of the other ship management functions. While on the surface the ship management functions look complex, it's actually really well refined to never feel overwhelming. This is in part due to the majority of tasks being able to be controlled by what the game calls VOS, or Verbal Orders System. This is basically a menu-driven approach to issuing commands for certain tasks. Want to boost power to damage control to repair your ship faster? Just hit 1 for engineering, 2 for damage control, and 8 for 50% of the ship's power. Now, if you want to take a more nuanced approach to this, you can open a dedicated engineering menu and manually select your exact power requirements. And if this isn't enough, you can further delve into a damage control menu where you can manually set exactly which systems should be prioritized for repair. There's also engineering presets that can be set, which are called power macros. Essentially, these are pre-configured settings across many systems which you can edit and save. For example, you can create a specific macro which prioritizes stealth and sensors, or one which sacrifices sensors but offers greater offensive capability. The idea is that the game can be as automated or as interactive as you like. Personally, I used the VOS for most of my playthrough, except when I required a level of precision, like transporting Marines over to a ship to capture it, which, while you can do from the VOS, lacks the finesse you may require. There's subsections for just about every key station: engineering, weapons, security, science, and so on. Oh, and there's even a library section which allows you to peruse an extensive database of information. In terms of the actual ships you'll be commanding, you basically start off with the least powerful ship in the fleet and slowly work your way up to the most powerful ship in the fleet. Each ship has a variety of upgrades, with the weapons generally being the most significant. For example, you start with a ship which has just 2 disruptors and 1 photon torpedo launcher, and ultimately end up with a ship that has more than 5 disruptors, multiple heavy photon torpedo launchers, and an experimental beam weapon which does enormous damage. However, all of the weapons in the game pale in comparison to the most deadly weapon in the game, ramming another ship. Now, hear me out here. Sometimes there will be accidental collisions which you can't avoid. However, in my opinion, ramming a ship is a completely legitimate strategy, especially in some of the earlier missions, which I'll get to why shortly. Just be sure not to overuse it, as you will also take damage when you collide, and if you collide with a ship much larger than yours, you will take a lot more damage than the ship you hit. Overall, the control and management of your ship are great. There was never a time that I struggled with control or management, even in some of the more challenging levels. This brings us to the other side of gameplay, the actual environment and mission design. I will say from the outset here, it's very clear the development team had lofty aspirations for the game. There is a hugely varied mission roster here, complete with branching paths, different ways to accomplish objectives, and a real sense of freedom as to how you approach the game. In one level, you are tasked with protecting a freighter that can't travel at high warp. With enemies approaching you soon, you are given the option to reposition to either a gas giant, open space, or maybe even the Mutara Nebula. Spoiler warning, don't choose the Nebula.
In any event,
in another situation, you have the choice to respond or ignore a distress call from another Klingon ship, with your actions ultimately coming back to either help or hinder you in the missions to follow. Honestly, for the year 2000, the level of player choice here was very good. Unfortunately, the level of choice the game gives you is sometimes its biggest downfall, and more often than not, conflicts with the game's mission objectives. I said before that the missions are varied, and they are, often with complex and sometimes dynamic mission objectives. The problem is that too often the game requires you to complete these objectives in a very specific order or using very specific methods which are not detailed in the briefing. In the best case scenario, you'll fail the mission. In the worst case scenario, you'll softlock the game. There's a mission very early on in the game which requires you to travel between several star systems. In the second star system, I decided to poke around with some of the command stations on my ship before warping out, only to find that when I arrived at my location, I had failed the mission due to a time constraint which is never told or visible to the player. Another issue with the objectives is just how vague they are at times. There's a mission which sees you going undercover in Chang's prototype bird of prey from the film. Now, this is a cool callback, but the problem is that there is an objective which requires you to scan a ship which is never explained in any detail and does not complete when you actually scan the ship. After a lot of trial and error, I found you have to get within a certain distance of said ship to trigger a cutscene to progress. This fact is never detailed anywhere that I could ever find, and trust me, I did go back and look. These are a few examples, but throughout my playthrough there were many more, each arguably more frustrating than the last. What bridges this from frustrating to infuriating is the lack of a save or checkpoint system within the missions, with some of the missions taking upwards of 45 minutes to complete, meaning that if you fail the mission because of one of these phantom objectives, you need to sit the whole thing through again and hope you don't come up against any others. I try and be pretty balanced in my assessments, and I'll often ask if something is a me problem as opposed to the game, but this is honestly just bad game design. The other challenge I have with the mission design is the pacing is all over the shop for the first half of the game. Now the second half of the game, which I arguably think is better in general than the first, is fine. I would even go as far to say that it's very well paced. However, in the first half of the game, the missions range from very easy to extremely difficult with no real middle ground. This dichotomy extends to the enemy AI. In one mission, you are facing AI that will literally destroy itself by crashing into a planet. In the next mission, you'll be facing an AI that is hellbent on using every strategic advantage it can to destroy a freighter you are trying to protect. Unfortunately for the AI, they underestimated my ability to ram them until they were destroyed.
He would have made such a fine Klingon.
The final point I'll make on things where I think the aspirations exceeded the execution are the planetary assaults. I get the idea, and it sounds really cool. Unfortunately, the execution misses the mark. The first challenge is actually finding out where on the planet you need to strike. The second is actually striking the planet without colliding or clipping through it. It just doesn't work very well, to the stage that where in one of the levels, the objective just actually magically auto-completed itself for me. It's definitely not all bad in the gameplay department, but there are several high-severity, high-impact issues which really get in the way of what is otherwise a really entertaining gameplay loop. While the game may suffer from some gameplay issues, the presentation is top-notch. Everything from the game launcher to the in-game menus all feel appropriate for the Star Trek universe, not to mention the 90-odd minutes of FMV detailing the plot. The 2000s were an interesting period where we saw quite a few games making use of FMV, but Klingon Academy is a great example of getting this mechanic right. Is it a cinematic blockbuster? No, of course it isn't. But is it of a high standard which easily passes the authenticity test? Definitely. The game also features a pretty robust graphics engine, which you can tell from the moment you see it is being pushed to its absolute limits in the best possible way. Ships, planets, nebulas, they all look great, with a dynamic damage system in use on the ships, meaning that individual systems and components of the ship can be destroyed and you can literally watch them blow apart off the ship. It's really good. Likewise, the game is pretty well optimized with no issues to report on era-appropriate hardware. There's a common theme in most Star Trek games that they all have really good sound design, and Klingon Academy is no exception. From the gentle hum of the ship to the sound of your weapons and ships clashing in combat, everything sounds like it should, complete with a very Klingon opera-inspired soundtrack, which really puts you in the boots of a Klingon warrior.
The warp field has been recalibrated. We are ready to warp on your command.
Voice acting, even outside of the marquee characters, is excellent and again, really helps to make you feel like you're part of the overall universe.
I do not want you to declare yourselves publicly. At the proper time, I will reveal everything. Until then, you will wait patiently.
Klingon Academy is an interesting game. On the surface, it's a tough recommendation, but digging a little deeper, for me at least, it's still one of the best large format combat space simulators I've played, and I'm not even aware of something similar releasing on the PC platform since its release. Whether or not you enjoy it probably will come down to how much you like Star Trek. Dedicated fans will probably enjoy it in spite of its challenges, whereas casual fans will likely have little tolerance for its many missteps. One thing is for sure though, the game does add a lot of value to the sixth movie, enriching its plot and helping to put the player front and center of the events leading up to it. As a big fan of the movie, for me this was worth the price of admission alone. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.